that sometimes. So make sure we're getting God involved in becoming a better husband. So this week, peacemaking. When it comes to, and a lot of these things, closeness, openness, understanding, those are all so closely related in becoming close and the wife feeling loved. Peacemaking is tied into it too, and it kind of goes back to one of the very first things we talked about before we even got to the acronyms, is the conflict, right? I'm guessing, just a wild guess, you probably had some conflict this week with your spouse. Maybe. Could have been big, could have been small, could have been over in 5 minutes, could be still kind of simmering a little bit. I don't know. But I'm guessing we probably all had some kind of conflict that we had to work through as husbands and wives this week. And that's the thing with life and with marriage, with the relationships, there's conflict. There always is. There's always we're humans, right? And we just talked about not wanting to be obedient to even God. And we fail, and we're selfish, and we do things we shouldn't do, and we treat each other the ways we shouldn't treat each other. And things bother us that shouldn't bother us. And, we're human. We make mistakes. So there's always going to be conflict and that tension that's in your relationship. It'll always be there to an extent. But when there is a rift, when there is conflict and that sense of tension, it's hard to be at peace with each other, right? If it's between you and your spouse, if there's that tension there, if there's that issue that isn't resolved, that's an open, discussion, it's hard to be at peace with each other. And when I say peace, it's not just we're not yelling at each other, but the peace of just like everything's good. Everything's fine, everything's nice, everything's good, there's no problems, there's no issues between us, that feeling of peace between each other. And when you're on the crazy cycle that we've talked about, there's no peace usually. There isn't peace when you're on the crazy cycle. There's no peace between one another. There's constant headbutting and tension and conflict because we're not treating each other the way that we're supposed to be. So there is no peace there. And God wants us to have peace in our marriage. God wants us to be at one. And the wife wants to feel that peace maybe even more. Now, doesn't want to feel it more than the husband, but will notice it more. Husbands sometimes cannot even realize they're in trouble, right? You could do things, be like, oh, I did not even know I was in trouble. But the wife is like, it's nagging at her, it's bothering her, and there's no peace there. And when there's no peace, for a wife especially, when there's no peace, it's really hard to feel connected and close to someone if you're not at peace with them, right? If you have an issue with something in your relationship, you don't really feel close. That right after or right when you start fighting, you don't want to just sit down and hold hands, and snuggle. It's not, you're like, no, don't touch me, usually, right? Don't even come near me. Don't look at me like that even, because there's conflict. So when there is that rift there or that tension, the wife is not going to feel connected. And she's not going to feel loved if she doesn't feel connected. I think we've established that here as we go for the last few weeks. So the last few weeks does show the wife feels loved when she feels connected to you, but conflict will come. We can't prevent it, right? You're not going to have a life where there's no issues and no conflict. It's just part of life. There's no way to have a marriage free from conflict. But what we can do is how do we handle the conflict when it comes? Right? How do we deal with it? How do we handle it? How do we resolve it? Or how do we just let it be? And that's where, when it comes to peacemaking as a husband, men are good at just dropping it. And if you have a disagreement with a friend of yours, another guy, and you get into an argument, and he's just like, all right, fine, whatever, we'll just drop it. And you guys are usually good with that, and that's it. That's the end of it. You decide to drop it. You may not even resolved it, but you're just like, fine, whatever, we're done. Let's just drop it. We'll move on. All right, fine. And that's the end. But women can't do that. They can't just drop it, right? It doesn't just forget about it. You can't just move on. It has to be resolved. It has to be fixed. And as a husband, that's something we have to make sure that we're aware of. We can't treat our wives like we would treat our friends, because it doesn't work that way. They don't work that way. So usually when conflict comes, again, like I mentioned, the wife may feel it or see it first, and the husband may be completely oblivious to the conflict that's coming. But as mentioned before, she'll move towards the husband to resolve it, right? We talked about that before, and how the husband treats that, and how the wife does approach the husband. How you approach him can either start the crazy cycle or get on the energizing cycle, take care of that conflict. But as she moves towards you guys, it's her goal is to resolve the conflict, to get it all out in the open, discuss it, resolve it so that you can be close to each other, so that you can move on, so there can be peace there. She needs that resolution so there can be peace in the relationship. So when that happens, don't run from the conflict. Don't be like, I'm not going to fight about it and just walk away. Don't shut her down, right? Don't just be like, you know what, I'm done fighting and end it. You've got to resolve that conflict. You can't just cut it off and walk away and pretend it's good, because it'll nag her, it'll bother her, it'll just continually go through her mind in that scenario, in that situation, until it's resolved. So you've got to be willing to address it head on. As a man, as a husband, you've got to be willing to take the conflict that is there, and maybe, again, you don't even see it, but if she feels it and is saying it's there, you've got to be willing to take the head on and address it and take care of it and resolve it and get to the point where there is peace. Conflict is not a sign of a bad marriage. If you're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, drop down to verse number 28. Verse number 28 says, But if thou marry, thou hast not sinned, and if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh. But I spare you. And this whole chapter is very connected. I would recommend you going and reading it as a spouse. But that one little phrase there, nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh. Again, we're humans. You're going to have troubles in your marriage. You're going to have relationship problems. You're going to have conflict. You're going to argue. You're not going to see things eye to eye all the time. And there will be trouble in a marriage. There will be. In that relationship, you will have trouble. So, it's just part of life. And it's how we handle those troubles that determine whether we're on the crazy cycle and not at peace, or we're trying to be on an energizing cycle and resolve things and have peace in our marriage. Go back to the first couple of verses here of 1 Corinthians 7. So, what kind of trouble we have in here. Now, bear with me here on these verses. We're going to talk about them, and we're all mature, so we'll be fine. Verse number 1. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife. Let every woman have her own husband. The next two verses here are what we're going to focus on a little bit. Let her husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. So, we can look at these verses, and I think we all know what it's talking about, what Paul's talking about here. He's talking about the marriage relationship and having a marriage relationship, and talking about not being your own. If you go back to the end of chapter 6, he talks about, as Christians, we're not our own, we're bought with a price. And so he's tying that thought of, once you're saved, you don't belong to you anymore, right? You belong to Jesus. He paid for you with his own blood, bought your salvation, and now we are to live for him. And he kind of continues that thought here with the marriage relationship that God established, that God expects the husband and the wife to not really be their own, to kind of give up their will and their way, and even in this physically, their bodies to their spouses. And that's the way that, God intends marriage to be. Now, if you've been married for an amount of time, that doesn't always work that way, right? We're selfish creatures, and we don't always treat each other in the selfless way that we should. But tying this into conflict, back at the church at Corinth here, when Paul was writing to them, there were people in this church that thought it was a good Christian, you were being a good Christian if you abstained from the marriage relationship, the physical part of it. They thought we're being good Christians, we're kind of limiting ourselves and abstaining, and that means we're stronger Christians. And Paul here, for the context, Paul's saying, yeah, but you do stuff like that, you're going to set yourself up to be tempted to do things you shouldn't do, because God has given you your spouse to fulfill that part of your life, to fulfill that desire that's in your life. And if you're holding back and for some reason trying to keep each other from that, you're setting yourself up to make some really bad choices in your life and some bad mistakes with other people that God did not intend for that to be. So don't do that, Paul's saying. You don't have power over yourself. Your wife does. Wives, you don't have power over your own bodies. Your husband does. And that's the way the relationship should be set up. Now, we can look at that and be like, oh, that sounds dangerous. That sounds, controlling and authoritative. But remember, as spouses, we're good-willed, good-natured towards one another. We love each other. We trust each other. You trust your spouse more than anyone else on this earth. Well, that's the relationship we're talking about here. When you trust someone like that, there's no fear. There's no worry in what that means, not having control over your own body. It was like, oh, that's kind of scary sounding. That sounds like control and power in a bad, dangerous situation. But again, if you're living your life the way, in your marriage, the way that God intends it to be, there's no fear there. There's no worry. There's no control. It's love. And it's giving. And it's selfless. And that's the kind of relationship we're supposed to have. So how does that tie into conflicts, right? When we have conflicts with each other, we get selfish. We think we're right. And this goes both sides. We're talking to the husbands here, but this also goes to the wife. We feel that we're right in conflicts, and it's usually the case. That's why conflicts come up, because you've got the correct view or opinion of something, and your spouse has the incorrect view or skewed view. And it's off, and it needs to be fixed. And that's where conflicts most of the time come. And how we handle those, if we're selfish and we stand our ground and we're firm and that's just the way it is, and a lot of times that's how guys will typically do it, is they'll be bullheaded and stand their ground and not give an inch, there's no peace. And when there's no peace in that relationship, the giving of one another to each other is very difficult to do. That's where you start to hold back. That's where you start to close off. And that's where you can start to damage each other's spirit, right? The husbands, you can damage your wife's spirit to where, when you want to do the marriage relationship, it's not going to happen. Because there's no peace there. There's no comfort. There's no love that she's feeling from you, because you've either dropped the conversation, you've determined you're right, there's nothing to be said about it. You're not willing and trying to make peace. You're standing your ground. And that's where, as men, we have to be careful. And we have to make sure that we're attempting to make peace. You want your wife to feel loved. That's our goal, right? We want to treat her in a way that she feels loved. Not being willing to make peace does not make her feel loved. It makes her feel less important, less worthy, pushed down, not the fine china bowl, right, that we talked about that we're taking care of. It makes her feel like we don't care. And we may not be saying it that way and even feeling that way, but if that's how we treat conflict, that's how she's going to feel. So Paul was pointing out here to both the husband and wife, they don't belong to themselves, just like we talked about there in verse number 6. Your spouse has control over that part of your marriage, that aspect of a marriage. So because we both have equal but different needs, right? Love and respect, they're equal but they're different. We're going to experience conflict. There are differences there. That's going to happen. But as spouses, as two that have become one, we can work out those conflicts. We can work together to work them out as partners. Basically, it's Paul saying here, he's giving a very specific example that definitely applies, but he's also saying the husband doesn't act independently from his wife, and the wife doesn't act independently from the husband. If the wife has control and power over the husband's body and the husband over the wife's body, that means there's no independent. I don't go off and do my own thing. I don't have my own life on the side that has no idea about, right? We don't act independently of each other. You act as one in life in general. So that's when we talked about being close, being open, wanting to understand. It's because we are the same person. We are two become one. But if we have parts of ourselves that are independent from your wife, right? If you have thoughts, ideas, plans, dreams, hopes that you don't share, emotions, feelings, even negative ones, depression or upset or feeling disrespected, and you don't share those with your wife, you're skipping the closeness and the openness. You're not trying to understand. And when conflict comes, all those things that you're keeping that are independent from your life together, that's going to create the conflict. Those little things that might be conflict, they're just going to be so much bigger because you've got so much lying underneath that you're holding back that's just going to add right into all those negative feelings, the feeling of not having peace. So understanding that each other has power over each other's bodies also shows that you're not your own. You don't act independently from each other. The husband should never act independently from his wife, and the wife does not act independently from the husband. We're to give up our way for our spouse's way and work together as one. And we have a hard time doing that as individuals because we're individuals and we're selfish. Even if we don't have that attitude, that's there. So we have to realize about ourselves. We have to realize that's how we naturally will be, and we have to fight against that. And if you want to have peace in your marriage relationship and have that just tranquility feeling, you have to work at giving up what you want, not just in the little conflicts, and meaning, you want chunky peanut butter and she wants smooth, and you have to give up your way to eat her peanut butter for the rest of your life. Those are silly little things, but if we can do that with little things, when it comes to the actual real conflicts, giving up your way, that's what we're supposed to do, especially when it's just preferences. But the thing is, if both of you are doing that, there's peace there. It's not the one side does it and the other side just always gets their way. It's that both sides are giving up their way constantly. And when you're always trying to do what's best for the other one, there's going to be peace there because you're always looking out for them, not you. And that's where it comes from both sides. So when conflict comes, as a couple, you work together through it to make peace and come to understand each other. When you do that, so when conflicts come up, when you have fights, right? When you hurt each other, when you full-blown, accidentally, on purpose, have those fights where you're just like, you hurt me by what you said, by what you did, but you can sit down and you can talk through it. You can see where you've made the mistake. You can walk through it. You can get to the part we're going to get to, saying the two words that are really hard for men to say, and that's, I'm sorry. When you say those things and you work that out, it strengthens your relationship. You become closer. You get through something that is difficult and hard and even caused by each other, but then you get down to it, you understand each other better when you work through them. When you work through those conflicts, you understand each other better, and it actually brings your hearts closer together. So on this earth, you'll never be rid of conflict, right? Your marriage will always have some kind of conflict. It's how you handle it that determines whether you become closer together or it drives you further apart. And that's the main thrust of it is working at becoming closer together. Again, the energizing cycle, not the crazy cycle. So as men, we have to make sure they're working on that. So why is it hard for us to say, I'm sorry? To a woman, and this might not be a 100% case, this is what he wrote in his book, and again, he's done all this research, study, marriage counseling. This may not apply to you, so take it with a grain of salt if you need to. But he says, to a woman, saying I'm sorry is an increase in love. It's to grow closer to the person they're saying I'm sorry to that they've wronged. But a lot of times when a man says he's sorry, he has a hard time doing it because he fears he's losing respect. He fears he's giving up ground by admitting something. And so when he admits that he's wrong and has done something wrong, then the person he's saying I'm sorry to loses respect for him. And he kind of goes down a notch in their minds. And that's what he's afraid of. And often that's why men have a hard time saying I'm sorry. Now, that can be pride, and it is pride. That's pride in a man's mind and his heart to say that, I don't want to lose respect, so I'm not going to say I'm sorry. That's obviously wrong thinking, right? But that's what kind of holds men back from that. So if we understand that as men and realize that that's not what happens, we can give up our pride and say I'm sorry when you are wrong. And women, when you understand why it might be difficult for him to do that a lot of times, even subconsciously, he may not think that audibly, that's what he thinks, but it's part of who he is. That's what he feels like he's given up. We can understand each other a little bit better. So he even feels that way, especially more so if he does say it and then is brought back up again because the wife's not convinced he actually meant it. So if you have a conflict, you resolve it, he says he's sorry, and you believe him, or you think he's being honest, don't bring it up again and regurgitate and bring it all back and go through it all over from beginning to end, because then he's really going to have a hard time saying he's sorry, because it's that respect, feeling that he's losing respect. Sometimes, guys, though, you have to understand, if she simply doesn't feel that the issue is resolved, she's not trying to violate your honor, right? She's not trying to take you down a notch by making you say it again. But there's something about the conflict that she doesn't feel is completely resolved. And so as a man, we have to not take it personally and understand she's not trying to disrespect you, but get to the point where, okay, what is it that's still not resolved? Where Where are you? And that, we've probably all been there where you feel like you've resolved it. And as guys were like, yeah, I said, I'm sorry, we're good. But something's still bothering her. So you need to find out what that is. The good thing about it, men and women listen to this too and understand this. If you humbly express your sorrow for what you did, right? When you come into conflict and you take your part, your side, I'm not saying that every conflict's the man's fault, although wives, you may say that. But when you take your part that you are wrong at, because there's conflict, there's two of us are wrong, and you humbly express your sorrow for what you did, when you do that and you're sincere about it, a good-willed wife that loves you, that wants to restore a relationship, that will get to her heart. Honest, good-willed, humble expression of your sorrow. Proverbs 15:1 says, a soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. So try to pull your anger down and your frustration and give a soft answer and be honest about it. See where you've made the mistake. See where you're wrong and humbly express your sorrow for it. When you do that with a good-willed wife, she will see that. And wives, be good-willed. Understand how he's coming, right? Don't make him bust through the Great Wall of China to get to the sorrow part. Understand he's coming and trying to get there. When you show a loving demeanor during conflict of any kind, men, you're more likely to get to her heart, right? When it comes to conflict, if your demeanor is just loving and not clenched in jaws and fists and anger and frustration and wound up tight, but when it's soft and loving and kind, do benevolence, you're going to get to resolve the conflict and get to the peace so much quicker. And for us as men, that's hard to do. Sometimes when conflict comes, our blood pressure goes up, we tighten our muscles, our back straightens up, we're ready to fight. Even when it comes to your wife. But we have to realize that's not how we need to approach it if we want to get to peace. God made her in a way that a loving, again, Proverbs 51 is true, right? The Bible is true. So a soft answer turneth away wrath. God made her in a way that oftentimes, if you come to her humbly and with that soft answer, and she believes you and you're being sincere, God made her in a way that oftentimes she'll reciprocate. She'll be like, yeah, I'm sorry too. And we can work it out. And I'm sorry for my part. But it has to start with us as men coming to her that way. But if she does sense in sincerity, get ready for a spin on the crazy cycle, because that's what's about to happen. If you're just trying to get it over with, just trying to drop it, just trying to get the resolution, whatever it is, just let's be done. I'm done talking about it. She'll sense that, and that won't go the way you want it to go. But what happens if you as a loving husband keep giving in, you feel that way in your conflicts, you keep giving in, but you still feel disrespected. You still feel like she doesn't believe you, or she's just not giving in to you. It's always you giving in. And again, wives, hear this too. I know I'm talking to husbands, but hear your side of it. If you feel that's happening, men, that you keep giving in and she's just not giving you anything and you feel disrespected still. This is weird, but I can tell you, I haven't necessarily said this phrase, but phrases from this book I have used numerous times in conflict. What am I saying that's unloving? That I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And when you're teaching this and studying it and it's on your mind, when conflict comes up, you're like, it's there. Like, okay, I'm being unloving. How am I being unloving? And I'm running through my mind, what am I saying? And then usually it's like, oh, there it is. That was not loving. That was harsh. That was sharp and not loving. And I can see in conflicts where I do that. So sometimes it feels awkward to say some of these phrases, but since you both are here, you both have heard the lessons, it will get you where you need to go, right? It may feel awkward. But if you continue to feel like you're giving in, but you're still being disrespected, you then have the opportunity to say, because you've been giving in, saying, I'm seeking to give in to you and be loving, but I feel disrespected. What am I saying to you that is unloving? So if you're in a conflict and you feel like you're giving in, but you feel like she just keeps disrespecting you and the conflict isn't being resolved, but you feel, man, that you've been doing what we've been talking about, you've kind of, I guess, earned the right to say that. And it's a good phrase. It's awkward. It feels weird. If you said it to each other in real conflict, you probably both laugh. And that might be good for the conflict too. But you could say, I'm seeking to give in to you, and I'm seeking to be loving, but I'm feeling disrespected. Be honest. When you feel disrespected by your wife, because she's going to disrespect you. You're going to feel that way, just like she's not going to feel loved by you. I know we haven't got to the chairs yet, but the wives, you're going to feel disrespected, and wives are going to be that way, just like men are going to not be the way they should be all the time. So you say, I'm feeling disrespected. What am I saying to you that's unloving? And your spouse is sitting here in this class and hearing the same things and maybe even reading the book. Good-willed wife is going to stop. She's going to see what's happening, and she's going to take a step back and respond in a way that's understanding. A reasonable, loving, honest request will cause a good-willed wife to pause and look at herself and say, okay, maybe I've been unreasonable too. But you have to be willing. Again, it's not I will if she will, and it can't be I will if he will. It has to be this is what we're doing. So you also make peace when you don't blame her, but instead confess your part, right? I talked about that already. James 5:16, confess your faults one to another. So be like, yeah, I'm sorry, but you did too. Well, if you hadn't done this, then I wouldn't have done that. If you hadn't said this or responded this way, well, then I wouldn't have done this too. But I'm sorry I did it, but if you hadn't done it, I wouldn't have. That's kind of not really a sorry, right? That's kind of it's your fault that I did what I did, and sorry that you did what you did, so I did what I did. Right? It's like, what did you just say? Did you apologize? Because I'm not really sure. So when you're wrong, say you're sorry for your part in it, but not to get her to say she's sorry. Wives, though, be willing to admit you're wrong too. Be willing to say you're sorry for your part, right? If we're both giving up our ways to each other, both of us are, that's where peace comes. If just the husband's giving up his way and the wife's like, fine, good, that better be, well, there's no peace there. But if the wife is doing the same thing, peace comes. Admit your wrongdoings. Admit where you are wrong, whether she will or not. But wives, same advice in this case applies to you as well. Admit when you're wrong. Be willing to admit you're wrong even if he's not. Be willing to want to work to peace. Ultimately, being at peace puts us on the energizing cycle. It can be difficult. Not can be, it is. It's difficult. Conflicts are hard to work through, but it's always worth it. So a few quick things as I close here. She feels at peace with you when you let her vent her frustrations and hurt and don't get angry and close her off. Allow her to just, we talked about that last week, allow her to just talk. It's not about the nail all the time, right? Allow her to just get it off her chest. Let her vent to you without shutting her down or getting angry. Admit she feels at peace with you when you admit your side of the wrong and ask forgiveness. That's another thing too. You can't just be like, okay, I'm sorry. Fine, I'm sorry. When you add the will you forgive me on it, that adds more to it. You say, I'm sorry, will you forgive me? And then that also on the wife's side, she could be like, all right, he's sorry. But then when he says, will you forgive me? In order for you to say, yes, I forgive you, means you have to let it go. Because you can't forgive him and then hold on to next time where I'm going to bring this up again. Remember when you did this last week? Well, then you didn't forgive. And if you keep doing that disrespectfully to your husband, why would he keep asking forgiveness if it keeps getting brought up again? Right? So ask forgiveness, be sorry, and ask for forgiveness. That's humbling thing to do too. She feels at peace with you when you don't let conflicts get to a point where you just drop it or just forget about it. She feels at peace with you when you forgive her for any wrongs she confesses. And then she feels at peace with you when you don't let bitterness dwell. We talked about that a little bit. Don't let bitterness build up against her, and always reassure her of your love. Always reassure her. That goes back to closeness, openness, understanding. Always reassure her of your love after conflicts. When you get to that point, you resolve the conflicts, you assure her of your love, then peace can come until the next conflict arises. And then you decide how to handle it that way. But if you're always looking to get to peace, peace is good. Having a peaceful relationship is where we all want to be. But that takes effort and work. So